Northwestern has fired football coach Pat Fitzgerald following a change of heart by the school's president, who had initially suspended him for 2 weeks on Friday, fired on Monday. I'm here with Jesse Simonton. Jesse, Michael Schill, the president of Northwestern, puts out a letter on Monday saying he fired Pat Fitzgerald. After further reflection, he started asking what he should be expecting of the head football coach. They released more from the investigation that they could have released on Friday but didn't. And it said during the investigation, 11 current or former football student athletes acknowledged that hazing has been ongoing in the football program. And it said a new media reporting today, still more former Northwestern student athletes confirmed that hazing was systemic dating back many years. This has never been about one former student athlete and his motives. It's much bigger than that. Obviously, that is because the whistleblower was characterized as someone who said they were going to try to get Pat Fitzgerald fired. And guess what? They did. The hazing included forced participation, nudity, and sexualized acts of a degrading nature in clear violation of Northwestern policies and values. I'm grateful that, to my knowledge, this is the President Michael Schill writing here, no student suffered physical injury as a result of these behaviors. While some student athletes believe the hazing was in jest and not harmful, others viewed it as causing significant harm with long-term consequences. The hazing was well known by many in the program that the investigator failed to find any credible evidence that Coach Fitzgerald himself knew about it. As the entire 6-month independent investigation was confidential, I only learned, this is Michael Schill again, recently learned many of the details, including the complainant's identity. I spoke with his parents on Friday and the student on Sunday. But you did learn about all that other stuff you just mentioned before the 2-week suspension was issued. So why the leap, Jesse, between 2-week suspension Friday, firing Monday?
I think you and I both agree that when the Batman spotlight gets put on your program, suddenly, it becomes a reality that you can't just kind of sweep some stuff under the rug. And we talked about it just yesterday, that Pat Fitzgerald is the most beloved figure in Northwestern football history. He's their best player. He's arguably their best coach. And even though they have struggled mightily the last few seasons, this was a guy that they wanted to keep in Evanston. He was their guy. And so I think they were willing to turn an eye, so to speak, kind of look the other way a little bit on some stuff. Because again, you have harped on this throughout. They have never denied what was in the investigation or in the report. They have they weren't explicit in acknowledging some of the details, but they didn't come out and throw a red flag and say this is not true, which the players did. And we can get into that.
Well, the players didn't say that to the investigator. The players told the investigator there was hazing going on. So that's the thing. You can say anything in a statement that doesn't have your individual name on it.
For sure. And the players totally kind of, stuck their own foot in their mouth too when they were like, and if there was something going on, coach didn't know about it.
Well,
and that's the problem.
Well, here's the damned if you do and damned if you don't. And I think this has more to do with Pat Fitzgerald's record in the last couple of years than whether he knew about it or not. Because you can spin that part of it either way you want to, depending on what you want to get out of the outcome. If he didn't know about it, then he should have known about it. If he did know about it, then you should fire him for knowing about it. But if he didn't know about it, but he should have because it's his program, and maybe that's why the wheels are falling off. So you can spin that if you're Michael Schill, who, by the way, is new there. He came from Oregon. He's not a longtime Northwestern guy, so I doubt he had a lot of sentimental attachment to Pat Fitzgerald. That's more of a donor thing than a Michael Schill thing.
Well, and I mean, to your point, we're making a huge fuss, or we would be making a huge fuss about nothing for another coach if they were 1-11 last season and 7-29 in 3 of the last 4 years. They absolutely would have fired him on Friday. But because he's Pat Fitzgerald, they didn't. And now this program is just, I mean, they were already looking at a tough fall where they rank, I think, in Bill Connolly's returning production like 122 off a terrible team. I mean, I don't know where you stand on this. I think that this kind of looking forward, I think you can make the case this is the worst Power 5 job in America now, considering the messy situation, the locker room that you're inheriting, where at worst hazing has been prevalent and folks have turned a blind eye to it, or it has been something that has just not been policed. There seems to be a cluelessness on race. When you add in the academia difficulties, you're playing in a Big Ten that's going to get more difficult. USC, UCLA coming in. I thought Stanford was that job, but Troy Taylor's recruiting at a top 25 level and hadn't coached a game yet. So maybe he can win a couple games this fall with the Cardinal and kind of prove me wrong there.
Here's why I'm going to push back on that. This was a program that was in the Big Ten championship game just 3 years ago. Now it was during COVID, but they were in it during a normal season in 2018. I don't know that Pat Fitzgerald would have been able to bring them back. I think you look at the last 2 years, the staff changes. That's a sign of a coach that probably has lost his fastball. That doesn't mean somebody else can't do it. I look at Mike Elko going into Duke and winning 9 games last year. I look at Clark Lee having a very tough first year at Vanderbilt, but then getting that in a situation where they're beating Kentucky and Florida in consecutive weeks at the end of last season. They're a very different program. They won 5 games last year. You mentioned Troy Taylor at Stanford, who's recruiting at a clip that David Shaw was not toward the end. Maybe they need a little fresh blood in this thing. And maybe that's what some of the donors, the president, maybe that's what some of the leaders at Northwestern started mulling over the weekend when everybody's yelling at them for only suspending Pat Fitzgerald for 2 weeks. We're thinking, okay, wait a second. And by the way, this is a private school. They don't have to say anything about how they dispatched the contract. That read very much like a firing for cause.
Oh, I agree with that. And I will say this. Vanderbilt, the Clark Lee situation is interesting. I've spent some time with him the last couple seasons. He's going by the rebuild a very different way than almost anyone else in America. The way he's really slow playing.
Well, it had to be really bad at first. They had to suffer
exactly
to get to those 5 wins.
And they did, and they did. I mean, you lose to an FCS team in your first game as a head coach. I think for Pat Fitzgerald, if some of that secret sauce was, that longtime defensive coordinator that was kind of his lieutenant retired several years ago, and it's fallen off ever since they've tried to find that replacement. What Elko's done at Duke is remarkable, but he inherited a pretty solid team. I mean,
David Cutcliffe was a very good quarterback.
Yeah, David Cutcliffe was a good coach, and Raleigh Leonard's one of the better quarterbacks in the conference. I do think Elko deserves a lot of credit for building a great staff there. Kevin Johns is a really underrated OC. There's hardly any talent right now at Northwestern, and I just think it's hard to get, you can't do the transfer portal dance that Dion and even Kenny Dillingham's doing at Arizona at these private institutions.
You still have a great product to sell. You're in the Big Ten. You have the most beautiful football facility in America. You have life in one of America's great cities. There's so much to sell there that Pat Fitzgerald is not the only human being who could ever win games at Northwestern. I promise you that. Somebody else can come in and be successful there. I think it's an easier job than Vanderbilt. I think it's an easier job than Duke. I think it's an easier job than Stanford.
You think it's an easier job than Vanderbilt? That's interesting.
Nothing is a harder job than Vanderbilt, Jesse.
Well, yeah, but I do think there's less expectations at Vanderbilt though. Because of what Pat Fitzgerald has done and the fact they have played.
There's also less top to bottom competition. Now, granted,
Illinois
has gotten better. But Minnesota's gotten better. Wisconsin is always pretty good and could be a lot better under Luke Fickell.
And the divisions are disappearing. So arguably they'll play
now you're getting Rutgers in Maryland and yeah. So listen,
it's a fair point. So do you think someone like, here's a candidate that I think we're going to see his name floated out there because he's from the area. He is recruited really well in Chicago, and he's the lead assistant on a team that's made the college football playoff 2 years in a row. Would you suggest Sharon Moore take this job?
If somebody is looking at Sharon Moore and I'm Michigan, I sign him to a coach in waiting agreement as quickly as humanly possible. And if I'm Sharon Moore, I do not move unless I can get a head coaching job in a national title contender.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though. You can't do that coach in waiting anymore with recruiting loopholes, because then you're not allowed to recruit on the road.
Michigan's head coach flirts with the NFL every other year. This way, at least you have insurance.
Now that's fair, but you don't want to take Big Sharon off the road. That's where he's.
I'm just telling you right now.
And I'm saying
lock that man down if you're Michigan.
If I'm Sharon Moore, I would wait for a better job. But if you're arguing that maybe Northwestern, because again, if I'm going to play devil's advocate to your pushback, it is one of the 14 jobs in the Big Ten that you get. That comes with a whole lot of money, and that comes with a whole lot of power. And that comes with a whole lot of agency and exposure. And even if you are 14th of 14, that's still a lot more shekels.
So 16 of 16 next year.
16 of 16 next year.
And we don't know that they're 16 of 16. Like, I'd rank them ahead of Indiana.
In terms of potential, I would agree. Yeah.
I'd probably rank them ahead of Rutgers. Upside. Yeah. At this point, I'd rank them ahead of Rutgers too. Now, we'll see when they play. But you make a great point, and this is something that we need to pay attention to. We need to see exactly what this chasm in terms of revenue that we now see with the Big Ten and the SEC and everybody else, how does that change how these jobs are viewed? Because like you said, this job is in the Big Ten. It is at the cool kids table. Does that change how somebody who has a good Big 12 job or a good Pac-12 job would view that?
Yeah, and I don't think someone's gonna want to follow the guy here, but they're gonna be able to pay. I mean, Ryan Walters got a pretty nice contract for never having coached a game because Purdue's in the Big Ten. If he goes and coaches at Louisville, he's not. And instead of Jeff Brom, if you flip those two guys back,
if Jeff Brom stays at Purdue and Ryan Walters is the new Louisville coach,
he's not getting that contract at Louisville.
Yeah.
Because of what the ACC can pay.
It's going to be fascinating to watch. And so we obviously did not expect there to be a college football head coaching opening already, but there is. So if you want to start the carousel running, and I don't think they're hiring a new head coach right now. My guess is they'll pull an interim from the staff and try to get through this season. But if you want to start the carousel running for who's going to get hired in November, December, watch this job. Because it is going to tell us a lot about how jobs in the Big Ten and the SEC are viewed, because this is one of the hard ones. But it's also in the Big Ten.
Is this remind me though, because I know you have that encyclopedia knowledge of your college football history. I mean, it seems like lately the carousel just never stops. Wasn't it last year that Clark Lee basically retired in the middle of July or early August? Or Bill Clark, excuse me, Bill Clark. Bill Clark. He
Bill
did,
Clark
but at UAB.
But they went with an interim all season and then hired Trent Dilfer. So they didn't hire Jim Grobe is the last one who had to come in.
Right. But I was just talking about the fact that it seems like everyone's like, oh, the carousel starts earlier and earlier. It just at some point it seems like
it never stops.
Somebody's getting fired or quitting or retiring any month during the 12 calendar months of the year. It seems like these days.
Yeah, this one's going to be absolutely fascinating though, because we knew what was going to happen in terms of the big two, the power two versus everybody else, just in revenue numbers. But all that stuff is really starting to hit home and sink in with these schools, especially knowing that Texas and Oklahoma will be in the SEC next year, USC and UCLA will be in the Big Ten next year. It's real now, and I want to see how these coaches view these jobs. And do they look at them differently? So Northwestern will be a very interesting test case. Jesse Simonton, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Andy.